right, for our final panel, I'd like to call up Craig Tiemann, the president of the Kentucky Wireless Association, to introduce everybody.
Good afternoon, folks. Today we're going to have, the panel's going to discuss environmental regulatory topics. And I know Stork loves this, all right? So we have, today we got four pretty seasoned professionals here. I think you average about 20 plus years in the industry, is that right? But nonetheless, they have several topics that they're going to be going through, of course. And the four that are here today are Ben Salter out of Asheville, North Carolina. Ben is the VP for ECA. And once again, 20 plus years in the industry. Second is Jim Bastard. Jim is a senior ecologist for Terracon out of Atlanta, Georgia. The third is Mr. Will Bates, who is VP and director for TriLeaf, based in St. Louis. And number four is Suzanne Derrick. Suzanne is Director of Cultural Resources at EBI and resides in Chicago. So I thought we'd kick this off. Will, I think you are first on the docket, if I'm not mistaken. And we're going to do this for about 30 minutes, and then we will have Q&A after that. So.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'm Will Bates. Thank you for the crowd that decided to stick around for a few extra minutes here. So I've got a couple slides here just to kick things off from a 10,000-foot level. Before I leave it to my colleagues here, my esteemed colleagues, to talk about some of the sub-disciplines. Today we're going to talk about the National Environmental Policy Act and some of the disciplines in it. Normally around this time of year when we do this panel, we're talking about regulatory changes that have occurred, because in recent history, there's been a lot of them, right? So with the advent of more technology, with different types of deployments, the FCC is usually a couple years behind the different types of deployments and rolling out more exclusions. But this year, and with COVID last year, we did not have anything additional as far as new regulatory changes. It's about the same. The only thing that happened last year was tribal tolling, which those of you who are aware of what happened last year during that time period know what I'm talking about. If you don't, functionally what happened was the FCC put a full pause on anything NEPA related for about, 6 months? It's 8 months. Which was painful. It was understandable, obviously. You know, a lot of the tribes were unable to be going about their business throughout the course of the year. And one of the questions I was sort of anticipating going to this panel, and maybe we can touch on, is could that happen again? And the answer to that, just be proactive, is it could. You know, nobody anticipated it last year, but it happened. But the major part of what I want to talk about, so now we have more tools in the toolbox, right? We have more than ever. We'll continue to have more than ever. And you know, if I can categorize those into subsets, I would say raw land towers, tower co-locations, rooftop and water tank co-locations, new small cell poles, and mods. That's how I would categorize them for our purposes on the regulatory side. And the reason I do that is because each of one of those different deployment types is going to have a different approach from a regulatory perspective. So I'm going to use the term exclusion because that is an important term to what we do. And exclusion is basically whenever you take, so you know, under the National Environmental Policy Act, there's 9 criteria. And if you meet certain conditions, the FCC allows you to exclude certain criteria. We can essentially ignore them. They assume that based on the type of construction you're doing, that it's not going to impact that criteria. Now, based on the different types of construction that we're talking about here, the different types of deployments, they'll have different impacts on different criteria. So there are certain exclusions that just categorically occur based on the type of deployment you're doing. But they'll happen in different likelihoods. So when I first started putting this slide deck together, I thought, well, maybe I can go through and do percentages. You know, what percentage of the time, for example, are you going to have a certain type of exclusion for a raw land tower? And when I started going through that process, what I realized was it's it's hard to do because it depends on the program, right? So if your program, for let's say you're doing a Raleigh Tower program where all of your towers are going in a right-of-way, that's going to look very different. It's going to have different likelihoods of exclusions than if you're doing a program where most of them are in farm fields, more the traditional greenfield site. So I came to the conclusion that that percentage wouldn't really be very helpful, basically. So I kind of abandoned the idea. But I still thought it might be helpful to show that that it's very muddy. So every time the FCC rolls out a new regulatory, a new programmatic agreement, they're called, where they have additional exclusions, it gets a little bit more difficult. Usually when these regulatory exclusions occur, they're not necessarily making it clearer, they're making it more complex because they still have to take into account those particular situations where they don't want to exclude it. And so what ends up happening is, now that we have all these different types of tools in the toolbox, it gets more and more complicated to decide what level of regulatory you actually need. And it's more and more important, therefore, that you involve us earlier in the process so that we can tell you what you actually need, because it's not necessarily going to be clear. It's not, I remember 12 years ago during Clearwire, and there were essentially only two questions we had to ask on a rooftop site. How old's the building, and is it in a historic district? And that was about it. Maybe is it a historic property? But now it's a spaghetti monster of different questions we have to ask based on the specifics of the particular build. And I know this slide is going to be nonsensical, and that's kind of on purpose. That's kind of what it looks like. So, if you're doing a Raleigh Tower, the greatest likelihood is you're going to have to do either a NEPA, a full NEPA, every category, or you might be excluded from some sort of SHPO. If you're doing a tower colo, most of the time you're not going to have to do anything, but you might have to do a Section 106 or a collocation exclusion review report, which is just a yes, you meet all of these criteria. Rooftop water colo. So you can see for yourself that it's gotten a lot more complex, and different carriers have taken it different ways, but all of them have approached it from the point of asking us to make sure that whatever they're proposing, whatever criteria apply and whatever they need to do from a regulatory perspective, that we sign off on it to make sure that it meets those. And that's definitely the best approach. It's one that I think the earlier we are in the process, the better we can help you. We can usually tell right away on certain aspects. For example, if you're talking about going on a building, the very first thing we can look at is how old is that building is in a historic district, because if either of those two things applies, we already know before you even do the design what the next step's going to be. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to a couple of my esteemed colleagues here. They're going to talk about a couple of the different disciplines under NEPA and what we actually look for. So Suzanne Derrick's up next. She's going to talk about cultural resources. Please ask her all the hard questions.
Wow, I'm too short for this. So I'm happy to be here to share some insights on the tribal consultation process as it relates to FCC projects. As most of us know, there's a unique federal relationship between the tribes and the FCC. And the tribes have no obligation to communicate with applicants or consultants. They do it to help move the process along, and for which the FCC has developed tools and procedures such as TCNS that helps us identify the correct tribes that have interest in a geographic location. So I don't know how many of you remember back to 2004, 2005, when the FCC was trying to get the tribes to participate in TCNS, but that tool has been invaluable in letting those tribes self-select their historic areas, original lands, and can express interest in a project based on that. And so we don't miss anybody in identification. How we do that consultation process is guided, and I'm listed 3 main places. One of them is the 2004 Programmatic Agreement. Section 4 outlines the sort of FCC's first pass at providing guidance on tribal consultation. That's also where they start talking about how to use TCNS. The second place we look is kind of recent, the 2018 report and order, the non-vacated portions. And there we got a lot of additional guidance on how to do the tribal consultation process. And the industry, I think, got a lot of improvements. Basically, if you go from 2005 to 2018, that process really had grown legs in many ways. There was uncertainty on how to close it out. There were increasing fees for sites that maybe didn't even have ground disturbance. And so the FCC, in their report and order, provided some more clarity. They provided guidelines on the submission, what's required to commence consultation with the tribes. And that, of course, is the FCC Form 620, 621, or the alternate submission packet. They replaced the early consultation timelines, such as they were, with real ones that are tighter, 45 days to 55 days if you have mailing involved. And then clarified a closure procedure. I don't know how many of you remember when you'd have tribes that would express interest early on, but then that interest would fade during the consultation process. And so you couldn't close at the end. So the FCC now has developed a process where we can forward the consultation to the FCC and they will take action on closing that consultation process. And lastly, they provided clarity on whether or not upfront fees were appropriate. They now align much better with other federal agencies in not paying the tribes for that initial invitation to review the project. And they align better with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation's guidance there. The last place we look for guidance on how this process should go is to the tribes themselves. They have websites, and some of them have interfaces or forms that will assist them in completing the review in a manner that makes it efficient for them. And the bullet point here is the important part, that as long as they don't ask for information or fees that are outside the scope of the FCC forms or the alternative submission packet, then the applicants and consultants do not need to provide that information unless that tribe identifies a historic property. My next slide is about monitoring. So commonly, maybe not that commonly, slightly less common now maybe, but requests for monitoring. Can tribes ask for that? And the answer is yes. Section 4 of the 2004 NPA identifies that, or tells us that if a tribe identifies a historic property that may be affected, then we must invite them to be a consulting party. And under that federal role, then, they have the opportunity to request things that would mitigate the effects to historic properties. Again, it's really important to understand and be able to differentiate generalized requests for monitoring and those that would mitigate the effects to historic tribal properties. And that's where using a consultant that is properly qualified, so one that has experience in pre-contact archaeology, regional archaeology, those are the ones that can have a respectful and professional dialogue about the resource that the tribe is concerned about. So you can create that opportunity to understand their concerns, and then as a consultant, we can work with our clients to properly mitigate those effects. So the last one on this slide is tribal monitor versus an archaeological monitor. Tribal monitor is one that is uniquely qualified to identify tribal resources. And the FCC has said that applicants simply have an obligation to engage a properly qualified contractor to conduct the survey and work. And now sometimes that properly qualified contractor will be the tribe itself, but other times an archaeologist that is, again, trained in pre-contact regional archaeology can be considered the properly qualified contractor. So again, there's a lot of benefits with engaging consultants that have the knowledge of the region and have the resources with the qualifications. My last slide is in regard to government consultation. So again, at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about the sovereignty of the Indian nations and their relationship to the FCC. So at any point, a tribe can request government-to-government consultation. And we do see it somewhat commonly with the Cherokee when there are sites that have risk of affecting the Trail of Tears. Now, sometimes tribes request this status, this government-to-government consultation, maybe in part because they see a pattern of sites that are affecting a resource that's important to them, and they want that federal agency to take a more involved approach. But sometimes it's because a consultant's been rude or an applicant's been rude, and that's not the kind of government-to-government you want to be triggering. Once you do have government-to-government request, the applicant and the consultant must immediately forward that request to the FCC, and then all communication between the applicant and the consultant cease. The FCC can ask us questions to help them in their consultation, but we have to take a step back. So that means that the tribal timelines for consultation outlined in the 2018 report and order don't apply once you've triggered government to government. And I think we've probably all seen the delays that have occurred with the FCC's staff of one person or maybe two people trying to sort out all these requests. So on June 18th, the FCC sent out a notification that they're going to be implementing some procedural clarifications to relieve that backlog and enable more timely reviews. So hopefully that will provide some relief. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right, good. Mine's a little long. Let's see. So are you guys seeing our slides out there on those screens? Okay. I'm Ben Salter. Yeah, that's it. Vice President of Environmental and Ecological Services at ECA. So as my part of the regulatory panel, I'll be talking about one of the challenges that folks in our industry face with regard to their FCC NEPA obligations and specifically threatened and endangered species. So in the eastern U.S., there are two species that commonly cause headaches for tower site developers. There are two bat species, the federally endangered Indiana bat and the federally threatened northern long-eared bat. You'll note that the northern long-eared bat has what's called a 4D rule attached to its threatened status, which I'll talk about more here in a moment. A few fun facts about bats. You can't talk about bats without talking about fun facts. They eat their weight or more in insects each night, including mosquitoes. They are the only flying mammal. They navigate and find their food at nighttime using high-frequency echolocation. These particular bat species, during warmer months and during the daytime, they roost under the loose bark or in hollows or cavities of both living and dead trees, and they hibernate in the winter in caves. Now for some not so fun facts about bats. See, I just pressed the button. The green button at the top. All right. So the presence of bat suitable habitat can result in significant delays and expenses for tower projects. As I mentioned, suitable habitat consists of, is that not it? There we go. Suitable habitat consists of those types of trees shown on the slides here, which are not uncommon in any given woodlot in the eastern U.S. where a tower site might be developed. That's a little unusual, the shagbark hickory on the left, but pretty common in Kentucky and Tennessee. The Indiana bat in particular causes more issues due to its endangered status, whereas issues with the northern long-eared bat are not as common. As you can see from this overlay map, the ranges of both species are quite broad, especially the northern long-eared bat goes way up into Canada. The northern long-eared bat's in blue and the Indiana bat's in gray. But what's important to note is that there's significant presence of these species in the area represented here at South Wireless Summit. A difficult aspect of bat consultation also relates to the broad range in that there are a lot of states that these bats occur in, and requirements can vary from state to state and are known to frequently change or evolve over time within multiple states. So most commonly, where Indiana bat habitat is present, agencies will require implementation of time-of-year tree clearing restrictions. So where these restrictions apply, generally, tree clearing will be prohibited during the late spring, throughout the summer, and in the early fall. So within our industry, it's not always practical to build your sites only during the winter. So where that's the case, where these restrictions apply and you can't build your site only during the winter, there are some options that are available. We're called presence-absence surveys, emergence surveys. Those are two options that can help you avoid the time of your tree clearing. There are some cons to those particular survey types. They can be expensive. You can only conduct them during the summer. Presence-absence surveys have the potential for positive finds of the protected bat species. And emergent surveys are usually only done for when there are just a few trees that need to be considered, usually 10 or less. So there's a third option. It's only available in two of our southeastern states, the lucky ones, Tennessee and Kentucky. So in Tennessee and Kentucky, mitigation payments can be made to offset the removal of suitable bat habitat. It's a relatively inexpensive option because mitigation, the payments are calculated based on acreage, and communication sites are generally pretty small. So it's relatively inexpensive. However, if you opt for the mitigation, then you're essentially assuming a take of a federally listed species, and per FCC rules, a NEPA environmental assessment must be prepared and a FONSI obtained prior to site development. So now back to the northern long-eared bat really quick. As I mentioned, the threatened status has got what's called a 4D rule attached to it. This allows the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to set specific actions that are and are not allowed. As I mentioned, issues with northern long-eared bat are pretty uncommon, and this is really due to the unrestrictive nature of this 4D rule, which is surprising in anything we do, that anything is unrestrictive. There are some consulting agencies, however, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offices in different states and state wildlife agencies that are providing, quote, recommendations for protection of the northern long-eared bat that could be interpreted by some as requirements. So it's important to understand the actual legal protections of this species so that we're not assuming unnecessary restrictions. You'll see there on the right, those are the situations in which tree clearing would be prohibited. Again, those are very uncommon situations. So now for a few solutions of how to prevent these additional delays and expenses as a result of the presence or potential presence of bat species. Consider preliminary environmental screening, have your consultant do a desktop analysis or attend a preliminary tech team walk, design your sites to avoid and minimize tree clearing, understand market-specific challenges, understand the agency requirements in your particular state, forecast for extra time and expense up front, commit to time of year tree clearing restrictions or to some of those options that I discussed earlier where you can avoid the tree clearing restrictions. And my favorite, and one that some clients have had really good luck with, if the timing works out, is if approved by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, consider clearing your trees prior to the beginning of the restriction period, even if you plan to construct later in the year. So say you plan to construct in July or August, go ahead, clear your trees prior to the restriction period, which usually starts around the end of March, 1st to April. If it works out, doesn't always work out. So for the last slide, I put together a table, which I'm happy to share with anybody who wants it. I've got some copies with me here today, or you can email me, and I'll be happy to send you a copy. This table provides the current tree clearing restriction periods for the Indiana bat in the states that are represented here at South Wireless Summit and in the states where Indiana bat is known to occur. You'll notice that not all the states that are represented here today are shown, and that's because Indiana bat doesn't necessarily occur in all of those states. What's important to note, and what you'll see here, is that the requirements vary from state to state, and I just hope that this table could perhaps be helpful to some of you out there that are working in multiple states, working across multiple states, or even in a single state where you're running into to bat consultation issues. So with that, I'll take any questions. Are we waiting until the end for questions?
I have a question.
Questions? Or are we going to take them now?
You off?
Yeah.
Ben, does the NEPA have to be done before you clear trees?
Say that again.
Does the NEPA have to be done before you clear trees?
Good question. It depends. If you have suitable bat habitat and you got bat consultation issues, then absolutely. Yep.
All right, which one do I hit here? The green button? Got it, great. So, hey everyone, hope y'all are doing well. I know it's hot in here and I know we're the last ones going, but thanks for coming to see us. We all appreciate it. And I'll go through my portion here as fast as I can to get everybody out of here. So I'm Jim Baxter. I'm with Terracon Consultants. I'm a senior ecologist out of Atlanta. And I'm here to talk to you about site challenges to do with wetlands and waters of the United States. Another thing we come across a lot in the telecommunications industry when you're putting up a new tower site. So there's three brief areas I'm going to touch on with you today. Proactive site selection. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the current waters regulations that we're under, and then a real quick slide about permitting that we're seeing for towers right now. So we'll start with proactive site selection. We work with a lot of site acquisition reps and the tower developers to use the resources that you can to try to figure out if you could be impacting wetlands or other jurisdictional waters on your property. So some of the tools I put on here that are readily available for anybody to find online are the U.S. Topographic Map, National Wetland Inventory Map, we call it the NWI map, or the Web Soil Survey. Three good resources to use that you can find. Another great resource are the folks sitting up here on stage. Your consultants can help you with this as well. So a couple examples here just to kind of show you what to look for if you were to do this. We've put a topographic map and an NWI map of the same potential proposed tower compound and access road on here. It's a little just hand sketch we did. It'll give you an idea of what you're looking for. So these maps show different types of water features that could potentially be on a site for you. You can see on there's streams, rivers, lakes, ponds. Both are good resources to see this. So if you look at the top map, the topographic map, you can see where your proposed access easement crosses over what appears to be a blue line stream, which would be kind of a red flag that could be a potential issue for impact there. Same thing if you go down to the NWI map on the bottom portion right there, you can see the green shading in the illustration there indicating there could be potential wetlands there as well. So those are the kind of things you want to be looking for when you go through these maps. But keep in mind, these are very, very preliminary. They're not always accurate, especially NWI maps at all. I mean, you'll find parking lots mapped as wetlands. It's because they're so outdated sometimes. So always, when you get to this point of a project, you can go ahead and think about moving this or rerouting your access, or you can call your consultant to help you and kind of figure out where to go from there. Well, there it goes. So I just want to throw a few pictures in there for some examples, kind of what we've seen where tower compounds have tried to go up in the past, of probably where you don't want to go and where you might want to go. So if you look at the top left, that's pretty obvious. That's probably not where you want to place the center of your tower compound. About as wet as it gets for a wetland right there. If you look at the bottom left, you'll see the same thing. Looks like a low area. very kind of muddy, swampy. It's not always very apparent, but these are some of the areas that are. If you look at the top right, this is an interesting one to me. I think this was over somewhere in North Carolina a few years ago, but there's a fence on the left of that picture. I believe there's a water tank compound next to it, but you'll see it's cleared out. That's where the access was supposed to go through, and it's kind of hard to tell how wet and muddy it is in that picture, but you'll see the plywood boards sitting there. Somebody had to put those plywood boards down to be able to walk through there and cut that path. So again, probably not an area you really want to put your access road if you can help it. And if you look at the bottom right, you'll see kind of a side slope of a hilltop there next to that pine tree. That's probably a good place to put it. So always, if you're unsure about these things, just let your consultants know, and we can help with site selection to kind of keep you out of some of these areas. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit into the current regulations we're under for the Waters of the United States rules. So when I first put this presentation together, we were supposed to meet over a year and a half ago before this rule was even in effect. It's called the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and it came out last June. So I mean, we're already about a year into this thing. It's being utilized by the Corps of Engineers pretty much across the country at this point. And one thing I'll throw in there is this did come out during the Trump administration. So a lot of questions I get from folks is, well, is this going to change under the new administration? And yes, it probably will at some point. We've heard the grumblings and kind of, something's probably going to happen under the new administration. But right now, this is the rule that we are effectively using with the regulatory agencies right now. And the goal of it was to kind of simplify what we would call a federal jurisdictional water and what we would not call a federal jurisdictional water. So they put it into two categories, the A waters and the B waters. Now the A waters are going to be your jurisdictional waters, and there's only 4 different categories of them. So first we have the A1 waters, which would be navigable waters and seas. And a navigable water, if you don't know, is basically something you can get a boat down for interstate trade and commerce. The Mississippi River is a good example. Or I'll tell you, if you're going to the Social tonight downtown, if we get a riverside view, you look out and you see the Cumberland River in downtown Nashville. That's a navigable water, if you're curious what that means. The A2 waters are tributaries. And what I mean there, stream channels. And there are 2 types that are going to be jurisdictional, perennial streams and intermittent streams. These are streams that either flow year-round or only seasonally when groundwater is high. Your A3 waters that will be jurisdictional are lakes, ponds, impoundments. And impoundments if you were to build a pond out of a stream channel or something like that. And the 4th category, which is the most interesting one, is going to be the adjacent wetlands. So you'll see the bullet under that. Adjacent wetlands are defined, they have to have a direct hydrologic connection to another A water. So whereas in the past, an isolated wetland would be non-jurisdictional, but if you were sometimes close to another feature, they would still take, the Corps of Engineers would still take jurisdiction over it. Now in most cases, you're going to have a direct connection with a pipe or a culvert or something like that for that water to be jurisdictional. So it's a big change. It's going to make a lot of wetlands non-jurisdictional that wouldn't have been under the old rule. And there are a few exceptions to it, but we don't have time to get into all that right now. But it's just an interesting thing that they've done there. Now I'll go to the B waters, the non-jurisdictional ones. There are 12 categories. I'm not going to go through all of them. We don't have time to do that. But we'll talk about a few of them that I feel are pretty important. And one of the most important ones is ephemeral channels, which I've put in here with swales, gullies, pools, and erosional features. But for those of you that don't know, an ephemeral channel is a channel that only holds water after a significant rain event. So it's not going to have water at all unless you've had a big rain. It'll usually have some kind of vegetation or something growing in the center of it. Now in the past, some of those features could be jurisdictional depending on if they had a significant connection to other waters. That's not the case anymore. If it's deemed an ephemeral channel, it is non-jurisdictional and it can be impacted. So that's a big change in the rule to be aware of. Isolated wetlands, we went over this in the last slide. It would not be an A4 water if it's considered isolated and does not have that direct hydrologic connection. So again, a big change there. Prior converted cropland, PCC, probably not that important to you guys. I put it in here anyway because a lot of tower compounds are constructed in crop field, access road going through crop field. The change there is that prior converted cropland basically means if you farmed land before 1985 and it used to be wetland, you can keep farming it in farming activities and not have to get any permitting to do that. Whereas if you were to change the use, say put a tower compound on it or turn it into solar, you could potentially have to follow wetland regulations. That has changed under the new rule. You're allowed to convert it now if you can prove that it is designated prior converted cropland. It's a pretty big change. Again, won't affect too much with what y'all do in this industry, but I'll put it on there anyway just because it's a good one. Artificial lakes and ponds, if they're constructed in uplands, they will be non-jurisdictional. And the last one, ditches, which is another one, important one like the ephemeral channels. You say you have a farmer who constructs ditches all over his property. If he constructs them in uplands, they're automatically non-jurisdictional now. If he constructs them within a former stream bed or within a wetland area, they can still be jurisdictional under this new rule, but they have to show perennial or intermittent flow, like we mentioned earlier. So if they end up being ephemeral, then they would be non-jurisdictional. So that's another pretty big change. A couple examples here in photos. The bottom left, this is a large ephemeral channel. This is somewhere in Arkansas, I think, from a few years back, but it's a good 15, 20 feet wide, and it runs off in the distance in the picture towards that wooded line there and connects with a major stream. The Corps of Engineers would have taken jurisdiction on this channel under the old rule. We actually resubmitted it to them under the new rule, and now it's non-jurisdictional. So it can show you a feature of that size. It can be pretty substantial. Same thing on the right. We have a wetland in the center of a field, only connected by kind of an upland swale that we determined was ephemeral. So now that connector is not going to make that wetland a jurisdictional feature, so it can be impacted and you don't have to worry about it. So just two examples there of some of the changes. And the last thing real quick, I just threw this in here at the end of the presentation because this just kind of changed recently. The way we permit things with the Corps of Engineers, the smaller permits we do, we call them general nationwide permits. They're made for certain specific types of activities when you're going to minimally impact wetlands or other jurisdictional waters. And we've never had one that was specific to telecommunications. We always used a number of different ones to kind of get that through with the Corps of Engineers. Well, they've come out with one, Nationwide 57, which will be specific to telecommunications, which is interesting. So it covers, the development of your tower compound and any associated features that you might need to construct with it. The biggest part of this one, in my opinion, is that the notification, you have to notify the Corps of Engineers if you impact greater than 1/10 acres of jurisdictional waters. Whereas in the past, there were conditions that you would still have to send it to the Corps of Engineers depending on what you were doing. Now, if you can keep it under that number in this new nationwide permit, you can normally be automatically covered under the permit without the submittal having to go in, which is an interesting change and a good change, I think, for this one. And I threw a couple notes here at the very end about the new nationwide permits. It used to be for streams, if you impacted greater than 300 feet, it puts you into a higher bracket of permitting that takes a lot more time and money. It's called an individual permit, a lot harder to receive and often denied if you can't prove good case for what you're doing. Well, they've cut out the 300-foot rule, and everything is done on an acreage basis now. So you can combine your stream and wetland acreage. If you stay under half an acre, water is a U.S. impact, then you can still get this nationwide permit, which is another pretty big change here that'll be moving forward with the permits that we submit soon. So that's pretty much all I had. And yeah, I'll remind you that all this stuff here I'm talking about is kind of based on a federal level. There are lots of state waters regulations you have to go through depending on where you are. So just always keep in mind to be looking at and ask your consultants, the folks up here. All these guys are awesome and know what we're doing, so always here to help. So I appreciate it. There you go.
Thank you, Jim, Ben, Will, Suzanne. Thanks for taking time to prepare this material. Now, is there any questions out there for the panel? We got a few minutes. Marvin? Anything? Woo!
I always consider
Stork.
it good. I always consider it good job security when we don't have a lot of questions. Because I will just let these guys handle this stuff. I don't want to talk about it. I actually have a question for the panel. I was kind of curious. So we spent a lot of time talking today about raw land towers, and that in general, because that's where NEPA generally applies across all the different disciplines we just talked about. One of the things we didn't really touch on, and something that I think, or at least I've seen a lot more of, I'm sure we have across the panel, is all the carriers just emptied their piggy banks on spectrum, and you have to assume that they're going to spend that money to deploy that spectrum, which means that there's going to be a lot of mods. And in one of my slides, I showed that even though it's a mod project, it doesn't necessarily mean it's excluded categorically from one of those NEPA criteria. Generally, what comes into play with mods is visibility. So even if you're, for the most case, mods don't run into a lot of regulatory hurdles because you're usually talking about existing infrastructure, that be a tower or a rooftop, water tank, what have you. And so you certainly don't have to worry about wetlands because your tower's already there. And usually what comes into play with that, if you do have any regulatory issues, it's because of a historic building or it's inside a historic district. And the one thing that ends up coming up is visibility, is that modification can be more visible than what is there now. And of course, we've all seen the antennas get larger and larger over time, whether it be beam forming or just bigger antennas. And I'm curious from the viewpoints of the rest of my panel on what criteria they use to determine what is more visible versus not quite as visible or of equal visibility?
We typically reference that the rule, is it larger, what is it, 2 feet? 3 feet larger in any dimension? So we use that, but a lot of our clients have risk tolerances too, so we apply those. And then we use Google Street View or visit the site and see in the field, is it more visible?
Yeah. Sorry, it's hard to hear the questions up here because it's.
It's a little
Speakers
warm
are
up
pointed
here.
that way.
Probably a little warm out there as well,
The whisper-
except for Stork. He's cool under fire. Is there any other comments from the panel? You guys good? All right, couple closing comments. The buses leave at 1 o'clock from out here to go to, you bring your bracelet, make sure you have that. 1 o'clock they start. I think there's another one at 1:15. And Katie, does that sound right? All right. And also, I just want to compliment Stuart Montgomery, Katie, and team for doing all the work you did. Great job. And thank our panel. Let's give them a round of applause, please.